Sarah Mitchell never imagined that the muscle memory from countless hours at the shooting range would save dozens of lives on what was supposed to be the happiest day of her family's year. As bullets shattered the peaceful afternoon at Lincoln Elementary School's Spring Festival, transforming children's laughter into screams of terror, a former Army marksman found herself facing an impossible choice: hide and pray for rescue, or pick up a weapon she'd sworn never to use again. In the space of a heartbeat, a sister's love would override years of buried trauma, and a woman who came simply to watch her 8-year-old brother perform in the school play would become the thin line between massacre and miracle. Sarah Mitchell adjusted the rearview mirror of her Honda Civic and checked her watch again. 3:30 sharp, just as she'd promised Tommy. The Lincoln Elementary School parking lot buzzed with families arriving for the annual Spring Festival, their cars creating a maze of minivans and SUVs decorated with colorful balloons and hand-painted signs. Sarah grabbed the bouquet of sunflowers from the passenger seat, knowing they were Tommy's favorite, and stepped out into the warm afternoon sun. The transformation in Sarah over the past 2 years had been remarkable, though she still carried invisible scars. After her discharge from the army following 3 tours in Afghanistan, she'd struggled with nightmares and an inability to connect with the civilian world. The hypervigilance that had kept her alive as a sniper in hostile territory became a burden in peaceful suburban life, making her jump at car backfires and scan rooftops out of habit. But slowly, with therapy and the unwavering support of her family, she'd begun to heal. Tommy had been her anchor throughout the difficult transition. When their parents died in a car accident 18 months ago, Sarah became his legal guardian at 26. The 8-year-old boy with gap-toothed grin and boundless energy had given her a purpose beyond her own recovery. Every morning when she drove him to school in her delivery truck for the local florist shop, every evening when she helped him with homework at their small kitchen table, she felt a piece of her old self returning. The elementary school's main courtyard had been transformed into a carnival wonderland. Red and white striped tents housed game booths where children tossed rings at bottles, and parents cheered from the sidelines. The smell of cotton candy and grilled hot dogs wafted through the air, mixing with the sounds of a small brass band warming up near the portable stage. Families spread blankets on the grass, creating impromptu picnic areas, where grandparents supervised toddlers, while teenagers helped their younger siblings navigate the various activities. Sarah made her way through the crowd, nodding politely to other parents she recognized from school pickup. Her therapist had encouraged her to attend more social events, to push herself out of the comfortable isolation she had built around herself and Tommy. Today felt like a significant step forward. Tommy had been rehearsing his lines for weeks, practicing his role as the narrator in the 3rd-grade production of The 3 Little Pigs. His excitement had been infectious, and Sarah found herself genuinely looking forward to the performance. She spotted Mrs. Henderson, Tommy's teacher, near the stage area and approached with a smile. The elderly woman had been teaching at Lincoln Elementary for over 30 years, and her warm, grandmother-like presence had helped both Sarah and Tommy adjust to their new dynamic as guardian and ward. Mrs. Henderson's classroom walls were covered with student artwork and inspirational quotes, creating an environment where children felt safe to learn and express themselves. "Sarah, I'm so glad you could make it, Mrs. Oogle." Henderson beamed, her silver hair gleaming in the sunlight. "Tommy's been talking about you coming all week." He's quite nervous but very excited. "Where is the little performer?" Sarah asked, scanning the area around the stage where children in various costumes were gathering. "He's in the classroom with the other children, getting into costume. The performance starts in about 20 minutes. You should find a good spot soon. It's going to be quite crowded." Sarah nodded and began looking for an optimal viewing location. Her military training kicked in automatically as she surveyed the area. She noted the exits, counted the approximate number of attendees, and observed the general layout of the space. It wasn't paranoia anymore, just a deeply ingrained habit that had become as natural as breathing. The school's security seemed adequate for a community event. A few local police officers mingled with the crowd, and volunteer parents wore bright yellow vests to help direct traffic and assist visitors. Finding a spot near a large oak tree that provided both shade and a clear view of the stage, Sarah spread out the small blanket she'd brought and settled in to wait. Around her, other families were doing the same, creating a patchwork of colorful blankets across the school's main lawn. Children ran between the blankets, their faces painted with butterflies and superhero symbols, while parents chatted about weekend plans and upcoming school events. The normalcy of it all struck Sarah deeply. For so long, her world had been defined by threat levels, tactical positions, and the constant weight of responsibility for other people's lives. Here, surrounded by the innocent chaos of a school festival, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Genuine peace, the laughter of children playing games, The casual conversations of parents sharing parenting tips. The simple joy of a community coming together to celebrate their children. It all felt like a different universe from the one she'd inhabited overseas. A group of teenagers from the local high school had set up a face painting booth nearby, and Sarah watched as they carefully transformed young faces into tigers, princesses, and robots. Their gentle patience with the squirming children reminded her of the medics in her unit, who had shown the same careful attention when treating wounded civilians in Afghan villages. The parallel surprised her, this connection between the tenderness she'd witnessed in war zones and the everyday kindness she was observing now. As the brass band finished their warm-up and launched into a cheerful rendition of When the Saints Go Marching In, Sarah felt her shoulders relax in a way they hadn't in months. Maybe her therapist was right about the importance of community connections. Maybe she and Tommy could really build a normal life together. One school event and quiet evening at a time. The crowd around the stage area was beginning to thicken as more families arrived and claimed viewing spots. Sarah checked her phone and saw several text messages from Tommy, sent from Mrs. Henderson's phone during the costume preparation. Almost ready. My pig nose keeps falling off. Can you see the stage from where you are? Each message made her smile, reminding her of his boundless enthusiasm for everything he did. She was composing a response when she heard the first sharp crack echoing across the courtyard. At first, it sounded like a car backfiring in the parking lot, or maybe one of the game booths making noise. But Sarah's body recognized the sound before her mind did. Her muscles tensed, her breathing changed, and every nerve in her body suddenly came alive with a familiar, terrible alertness. Around her, other parents continued their conversations. Children kept playing. The brass band played on. They didn't know. They hadn't heard what she'd heard. The second shot was unmistakable. Sarah was already moving before the screaming started, her body operating on instincts honed by years of training and combat experience. The peaceful family festival exploded into chaos as panicked parents grabbed their children and began running in all directions. The brass band's music stopped abruptly, replaced by shouts of confusion and terror. Blankets and folding chairs were abandoned as families fled toward their cars or sought shelter behind the various booth structures. But Sarah wasn't running away. Every fiber of her being was focused on one single, driving need: getting to Tommy. He was still in the classroom, still in costume, still unaware that their perfect afternoon had transformed into something else entirely. As gunshots continued to echo across the courtyard, growing closer and more frequent, Sarah pushed against the tide of fleeing families, fighting her way toward the school building where her little brother was waiting for his moment on stage. The training that had once made her one of the Army's most effective long-range specialists was awakening again, bringing with it a cold clarity of purpose that cut through the chaos like a blade. Sarah Mitchell was no longer just a delivery driver and guardian trying to build a quiet life. She was a soldier again, and someone was threatening her family. The gunfire was coming from multiple directions now, and Sarah's trained ear could distinguish at least 3 different weapons. As families scattered in panic around her, she forced herself to stop running and assess the situation with military precision. The attackers were moving methodically through the festival grounds, and their positioning suggested this wasn't random violence but a coordinated assault. Sarah crouched behind an overturned picnic table and pulled out her phone, dialing 911 while scanning the chaos around her. The local police officers she'd seen earlier were nowhere in view, and she could hear return fire from somewhere near the parking lot, suggesting at least some law enforcement was engaging the attackers. But response time for additional backup would be crucial, and every second counted. 911, what's your emergency? Active shooter situation at Lincoln Elementary School Festival. Multiple gunmen, automatic weapons, hundreds of civilians including children on site. Sarah's voice was calm and precise, falling automatically into the crisp military communication style that had once guided airstrikes and coordinated rescue missions. Ma'am, units are already en route. Are you in a safe location? Negative. I'm moving to secure civilians in the main building. I'm former military sniper specialist. Badge number. Sarah rattled off her Army identification numbers, knowing it would help establish her credibility with responding units. The dispatcher's voice became more focused. Copy that, Sergeant Mitchell. What's your assessment of the situation? At least 3 shooters moving in coordinated pattern from east parking lot toward main courtyard. They're driving civilians toward the school building. Possibly intentional funneling. I count approximately 40 to 60 children and adults who made it inside, but they're trapped. As she spoke, Sarah was moving again, using the festival booths and abandoned vehicles for cover as she worked her way toward the school. Her military training had taught her to read tactical situations like a map, and what she saw developing made her stomach turn with recognition. The attackers weren't just shooting randomly. They were hurting people, creating a kill zone with the school building as the final trap. Through the main hallway windows, she could see frightened faces pressed against the glass. Teachers were following lockdown protocols, but the classroom doors were designed for privacy, not security. If the shooters reached the building, those thin wooden barriers wouldn't stop them for more than a few seconds. A young mother with 2 small children had taken shelter behind Sarah's position, the woman's face pale with terror as she clutched her crying babies. "My daughter," she whispered frantically. "My daughter's in the 3rd grade classroom. She's in there with all those kids." 3rd grade, Tommy's class. Sarah handed the woman her phone. "Stay on the line with 911. Tell them Officer Sarah Mitchell is moving to the building's west entrance and will attempt to establish defensive position." "Can you do that?" The woman nodded, taking the phone with shaking hands. Sarah checked her watch. 6 minutes since the first shot. In her experience, response time for specialized tactical units would be another 10 to 15 minutes minimum, even in a well-prepared suburban area like this. The local police were brave and well-trained, but they were dealing with military-style weapons and coordinated tactics that required a different level of response. She reached the west entrance just as Mrs. Empire. Henderson was attempting to lock the main doors from inside. The elderly teacher's hands were shaking so badly she couldn't turn the key, and Sarah could see her struggling with the unfamiliar emergency procedures. Behind Mrs. Henderson, the hallway was packed with children and adults who had made it to safety, their faces reflecting confusion and growing fear as the sounds of gunfire grew closer. Sarah tapped on the glass and mouthed, "It's me," to Mrs. Henderson, who immediately recognized her and opened the door. As Sarah slipped inside, she could hear someone trying to maintain calm authority over the crowd of frightened people. "Everyone stay low and quiet," a man's voice was saying. "Teachers, account for your students. Parents, help us keep the children calm." The speaker was Principal Rodriguez, a man Sarah had met briefly during Tommy's enrollment. He was doing his best to manage an impossible situation, but Sarah could see the overwhelming stress in his eyes. Like most educators, he'd trained for emergency situations, but never expected to face a military-style assault on his school. "Principal Rodriguez," Sarah called out quietly, and he turned toward her with visible relief. "Sarah, thank God. Tommy's asking for you. He's in Mrs. Henderson's classroom." "Where exactly are all the children positioned?" 3rd and 4th grades in Mrs. K. Papers. Henderson's room. Kindergarten and 1st grade in Mrs. Patterson's room across the hall. 2nd grade and some parents in the library. He gestured toward the various locations. "We got most everyone inside, but..." His voice trailed off as they heard more gunshots, these much closer to the building. Through the main hallway windows, Sarah could see muzzle flashes and movement in the courtyard. The attackers were advancing toward the school, just as she'd predicted. Sarah's mind was already calculating angles, distances, and tactical possibilities. The school's layout provided some advantages: long hallways with good sight lines, multiple exits, and solid interior walls that could provide cover. But it also presented challenges: too many civilians in too small a space, limited defensive positions, and nowhere to retreat if the attackers breached the building. "Principal Rodriguez, I need you to listen very carefully," Sarah said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she'd used when briefing military personnel. "I'm former Army sniper specialist. Those aren't random shooters out there. They're operating with military tactics, and they're going to try to breach this building." His face went pale, but he nodded. "What do we do?" "First, get everyone away from the windows and into the interior rooms. Second, I need to know what security measures you have. Any locked doors between here and the classrooms. Any reinforcement possibilities. We can lock the individual classroom doors, and there's a security gate that seals off the main hallway from the front entrance. But do it. Lock everything you can. And I need you to find out if there are any weapons on the premises. Anything. Security guard equipment, maintenance tools that could be used defensively, even a stapler gun from the office." Rodriguez looked shocked. "Sarah, surely the police." Another burst of gunfire cut him off, this time accompanied by the sound of breaking glass from somewhere in the building. Sarah heard screams from one of the classrooms, followed by Mrs. Patterson's voice trying to reassure the younger children. "The police are coming, but they're not here yet," Sarah said grimly. "And those people outside aren't going to wait for them." She was already moving toward Mrs. Gray. Henderson's classroom, where Tommy was waiting with the other 3rd graders. As she pushed open the door, she saw 23 children huddled against the far wall, still wearing their costumes for the play that would never happen. Tommy spotted her immediately and started to run toward her, but Mrs. Henderson gently held him back. "Sarah, Tommy called out in a loud whisper, his pig-nose costume askew and his eyes wide with confusion. "What's happening?" "Why can't we do our play?" Sarah knelt down so she was at his eye level, forcing herself to project calm despite the chaos building inside her chest. "Hey, buddy, there's some trouble outside, so we're all staying inside for a while until the police sort it out. Like a fire drill, remember?" Tommy nodded solemnly. At 8 years old, he was still young enough to trust adults to handle scary situations, but old enough to sense that something serious was happening. "Are you staying with us?"
"I'm staying close," Sarah promised.
"Mrs. Henderson and Principal Rodriguez are taking good care of everyone. I just need to help them figure out the best way to keep everyone safe." She stood and moved to where Mrs. Crowd. Henderson was standing near the classroom door, her experienced teacher's instincts keeping her positioned between the children and any potential threat. "How many total people in the building?" Sarah asked quietly. "About 60 children, maybe 20 adults, including parents who made it inside before the lockdown." Sarah nodded, processing the numbers. 80 civilians, mostly children, against at least 3 armed attackers with military weapons and tactical training. The math was stark, but not impossible. She'd faced worse odds in Afghanistan, though never with children's lives directly in the balance. The sound of breaking glass echoed from the front of the building, followed by a voice shouting commands that Sarah recognized as tactical communication. The attackers had breached the perimeter and were inside the school. In a matter of minutes, they would begin clearing rooms systematically, and all the locked doors and emergency protocols in the world wouldn't stop them. Sarah looked at Tommy one more time, his innocent face still trusting that his big sister would keep him safe, just as she always had. Then she turned back to Mrs. Henderson and Principal Rodriguez, who were both looking at her with expressions that mixed hope and desperate fear. "I need to know right now," Sarah said quietly. "Is there any place in this building where I can find a rifle?" Principal Rodriguez stared at Sarah for a long moment, processing her question while the sounds of the attackers moving through the building grew closer. His face reflected the terrible calculation of a man forced to choose between policy and survival. "The security office," he said finally. "Officer Johnson keeps his service weapon locked in a safe there, and there's an old hunting rifle in my office from the 6th grade outdoor education program. It hasn't been used in years. Show me." They moved quickly through the hallway, staying low and avoiding the windows. Sarah could hear the attackers systematically checking rooms on the opposite end of the building, their voices carrying the cold professionalism she remembered from her own unit communications. They were trained, disciplined, and methodical, which meant they were also predictable. Rodriguez's office was tucked behind the main administrative area, a small space cluttered with paperwork and educational materials. He pulled a key from his desk drawer and opened a tall cabinet in the corner, revealing a bolt-action hunting rifle wrapped in cloth and a small box of ammunition. "Winchester Model 70, .308 caliber, Rodriguez said apologetically. "It's probably 20 years old, and I don't even know if it's properly sighted." Sarah lifted the rifle and examined it with practiced efficiency. The weapon was old but well maintained, with a decent scope that would be adequate for the distances she'd be working with inside the building. The .308 ammunition was perfect for her purposes, powerful enough to stop an attacker reliably, but without the over-penetration risk that might endanger civilians in adjacent rooms. "This will work," she said, checking the action and loading the rifle. "Principal Rodriguez, I need you to understand something very clearly. I'm going to try to stop these people, but that means I'm going to use lethal force if necessary. Once I do that, this situation becomes very different for everyone involved." Rodriguez nodded grimly. "Those children, if those men reach the classrooms, they won't," Sarah said with quiet certainty. "But I need you to get back to the others and keep them calm and quiet. No matter what you hear, keep everyone in the interior rooms and away from the hallways until law enforcement gives the all clear." As Rodriguez headed back toward the classrooms, Sarah took a moment to center herself mentally. She had fired this type of weapon thousands of times in training and combat, but never in a situation like this. Never with her little brother's life hanging in the balance. Never with children depending on skills she'd hoped never to use again. The familiar weight of the rifle in her hands brought back memories she'd spent 2 years trying to suppress. Desert outposts where she'd waited for hours for the perfect shot. Urban environments where split-second decisions meant the difference between saving lives and causing catastrophic collateral damage. The particular silence that followed, when a mission was completed successfully. She pushed those memories aside and focused on the immediate tactical situation. From the sounds echoing through the building, the attackers had split into 2 groups. One was working through the classrooms on the east side, while the other was moving toward the main administrative area where she was currently positioned. They were being thorough but not rushed, which suggested they believed they had time to complete their objective without interference. Sarah moved to a position near the main hallway intersection where she could observe both approach routes. The hallway was long and straight, providing excellent sightlines but limited cover. She settled into a stable shooting position behind the corner of the administrative office, using the doorframe to steady her aim while remaining mostly concealed. Through the scope, she could see the far end of the hallway, where emergency lighting cast strange shadows against the institutional walls. The building's architecture, designed for education and community, had become a battlefield, and she was about to transform from guardian and sister back into the soldier she'd tried to leave behind. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and she glanced down to see Tommy's name. Mrs. Henderson was letting him send messages to keep him calm. "Are you still close by? I'm scared, but being brave like you taught me." Sarah's throat tightened as she typed back quickly. "Very close. Keep being brave for just a little longer." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the east hallway. Sarah adjusted her position and controlled her breathing, falling into the meditative calm that had once made her one of the Army's most effective marksmen. Through the scope, she watched the intersection point where the attackers would first become visible. The first figure appeared at the corner, a man in tactical gear, carrying an assault rifle, moving with the careful precision of someone checking for threats. Sarah had less than 2 seconds to make her assessment. Armed, clearly part of the attacking force, positioning himself to engage civilians. The decision calculus that had once guided her through combat zones in Afghanistan was brutally simple. Immediate threat to innocence required immediate response. Sarah's finger found the trigger as she centered the crosshairs. Everything else in her world, the fear, the memories, the weight of what she was about to do, faded into background silence. There was only the target, the shot, and the children she was protecting. The rifle fired once. The sound echoed through the hallway like thunder, followed by shouting from the attackers' remaining positions. Sarah worked the bolt action smoothly and repositioned, knowing that she'd revealed her location and would need to move quickly. The tactical advantage of surprise was now gone, but she'd eliminated one immediate threat and altered the attackers' understanding of what they were facing. Her phone rang, and she answered quickly while maintaining her overwatch position. "This is Sergeant Mitchell. What's your status, dispatch?" "Tactical units are 3 minutes out." "What's your situation?" "1 hostile down, at least 2 remaining in the building." "I'm engaging from the administrative area. Civilians secured in interior classrooms." "Sergeant, you need to identify yourself clearly to responding units. They don't know you're a friendly." "Understood. I'll be wearing a yellow festival volunteer vest and will identify myself verbally when they arrive." Sarah grabbed one of the abandoned volunteer vests from the office and put it on over her civilian clothes. It wasn't military identification, but it would help distinguish her from the attackers when police arrived. The remaining attackers had gone silent, which was both good and bad. Good because it meant they'd stopped their systematic advance toward the classrooms. Bad because it meant they were now adapting their tactics to account for her presence. And she had no way of knowing their new plan. She moved to a different position, choosing a spot that provided coverage of both the main hallway and the route toward the classrooms where Tommy was waiting. Through the scope, she could see movement at the far end of the building, shadows shifting in ways that suggested the attackers were repositioning. Her military training told her to maintain her defensive position and wait for backup, but her protective instincts as Tommy's guardian were screaming at her to move toward the classrooms, to put herself physically between the remaining threats and the children. The tension between tactical wisdom and fierce love created a focus so intense it was almost painful. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. Then Sarah heard something that made her blood turn cold. The sound of someone trying to force open one of the classroom doors. The attackers had found another route to the children, and she was out of position to stop them. Sarah was moving before she'd consciously decided to act. The rifle held ready as she sprinted down the hallway toward the classrooms where 80 innocent people were depending on her to keep them alive. The sound of splintering wood reached Sarah's ears as she rounded the corner toward the classroom wing. One of the attackers was using a crowbar to force open the door to Mrs. Patterson's room, where the kindergarten and first-grade children were sheltering. The man's back was to Sarah, his attention focused entirely on breaching the door while his partner provided overwatch from the opposite end of the hallway. Sarah dropped to one knee and raised the rifle, but hesitated for a split second as she realized the proximity of the children to her target. The classroom door was thin, and she needed to be absolutely certain her shot wouldn't penetrate through to the other side where terrified 5- and 6-year-olds were huddled against the wall. That moment of hesitation nearly cost her everything. The Overwatch attacker spotted her movement and began raising his weapon. Sarah shifted her aim and fired without thinking, her muscle memory taking over as the crosshairs found center mass. The second attacker dropped, but the noise caused the first man to abandon his efforts with the door and spin toward her position. Sarah worked the bolt action as she rolled sideways, seeking cover behind a water fountain as bullets sparked off the hallway walls where she'd been kneeling. The remaining attacker had better positioning and superior firepower, but Sarah had spent years learning to make impossible shots under extreme pressure. The difference was that, in Afghanistan, she'd usually had the luxury of distance and concealment. Here, she was fighting at close quarters with children's lives directly in the balance. She could hear crying from inside Mrs. Patterson's classroom, the sound of small voices asking why the door was making noise. The kindergartners didn't understand what was happening, which was probably a mercy. But their fear was audible through the damaged door, and Sarah felt a rage building inside her chest that was both familiar and terrifying. The last attacker was positioned at the intersection of two hallways, giving him coverage of multiple approach routes while keeping Sarah pinned down. He was smart enough to know that police response was imminent, but confident enough in his position to take his time eliminating her before continuing with whatever objective had brought him here. Sarah's phone buzzed with another message from Tommy. "I hear loud noises. Are you okay?" She typed back quickly. "I'm okay. Stay quiet and listen to Mrs. Henderson no matter what." The simple act of communicating with Tommy reminded her that this wasn't Afghanistan, and she wasn't just a soldier following orders. She was a big sister who had promised to protect a little boy who trusted her completely. The rage she felt crystallized into something colder and more focused than anger. It became purpose. Sarah analyzed the tactical situation with the methodical precision that had made her effective in combat. The attacker's position was strong but not perfect. He was forced to split his attention between her location and the potential arrival of police backup. He also couldn't know that she was former military, which meant he was probably underestimating her capabilities. Most importantly, he was between her and the children. That made the choice simple. Sarah pulled the fire alarm. The piercing sound filled the hallway, adding to the chaos and providing audio cover for movement. As the alarm blared, Sarah used the noise to mask her repositioning, moving quickly to a different angle that would allow her to engage the attacker while minimizing risk to the classrooms. The attacker was disoriented by the sudden alarm, looking around for the source of the noise. Sarah saw her opportunity and took the shot, but at the same moment he moved, and her bullet struck the wall inches from his head. He returned fire immediately, forcing her back into cover as plaster and paint chips exploded around her position. Through the chaos, Sarah could hear sirens approaching the school. The tactical units were arriving, but they would need several minutes to establish a perimeter, assess the situation, and begin their entry procedures. In a close-quarters firefight, several minutes might as well be several hours. The remaining attacker seemed to realize that his window of opportunity was closing. Instead of continuing to engage Sarah, he turned his attention back to the classroom doors, apparently determined to complete his objective before law enforcement arrived. Sarah watched in horror as he began systematically firing at the door locks, preparing to force entry into the rooms where the children were hiding. That was when Sarah Mitchell stopped thinking like a soldier and started acting like a big sister. She stood up from her cover position and walked into the center of the hallway, rifle raised and aimed directly at the attacker's center mass. There was no tactical advantage to her position, no cover to protect her from return fire, no backup plan if she missed. There was only the absolute certainty that this man would not reach those children while she was still breathing. "Hey!" she called out loudly. The attacker turned towards her, raising his weapon. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, they faced each other across 30 feet of institutional hallway, while the fire alarm continued its piercing wail. Sarah could see his eyes through the tactical goggles, could read the surprise and calculation as he processed this unexpected development. He was young, probably mid-20s, with the kind of focused intensity that suggested military or law enforcement training. In another context, he might have been someone Sarah would have served alongside, someone who'd sworn the same oath to protect and defend. But context was everything, and in this context he was standing between her and children who trusted her to keep them safe. Sarah's rifle was already aimed and ready. The attacker was raising his weapon but hadn't reached firing position yet. She had the advantage, but barely, and only for another second or two. Time seemed to slow as Sarah's training took over completely. Her breathing steadied, her grip on the rifle became rock solid, and the world narrowed to nothing but the crosshairs and the target. She could hear Tommy's laugh from earlier that afternoon, could see Mrs. Henderson's kind smile as she talked about the children's excitement for their play. The attacker's weapon was almost in position. Sarah fired. The rifle's report echoed through the hallway, mixing with the fire alarm and the distant sounds of police sirens. The attacker dropped immediately, his weapon clattering across the floor as he fell. Sarah worked the bolt action one more time and maintained her aim, watching for any sign of movement. But there was none. Silence settled over the hallway, except for the continuing fire alarm and the muffled sounds of children crying inside the classrooms. Sarah stood in the center of the corridor, still holding the rifle, still scanning for threats, still running on the adrenaline and hypervigilance that had carried her through the engagement. It wasn't until she heard Principal Rodriguez's voice calling her name that she began to come back to herself. "Sarah, is it over?" She turned toward the sound of his voice and saw him peering cautiously around the corner from the administrative area. Behind him, she could make out the shapes of police officers in tactical gear, their weapons drawn but lowered as they assessed the scene. "It's over," Sarah said quietly, slowly lowering the rifle. All threats neutralized, as she spoke those words. The same phrase she'd used dozens of times in Afghanistan to signal the completion of a mission. Sarah realized that something fundamental had changed inside her, not just in the last few minutes, but over the course of the entire day. She'd started the afternoon as a civilian, a delivery driver and guardian, trying to build a peaceful life. She'd become a soldier again when circumstances demanded it. And now, as police officers moved past her to secure the scene and paramedics rushed toward the building, she was becoming something new. Someone who had chosen to stand between innocence and evil, and had proven capable of making that choice when it mattered most. The classroom doors began opening slowly as teachers and administrators realized the immediate danger was over. Sarah heard Tommy's voice calling her name, heard the relief and excitement as children realized they were safe. In a few moments, she would kneel down and hug her little brother, would reassure him that everything was okay, would begin the process of helping all these children understand what they'd experienced. But first, she had to surrender the weapon to law enforcement and begin answering the questions that would determine whether her actions were justified, legal, and proportionate to the threat. She had to transition from soldier back to civilian, from guardian angel back to big sister, from someone who had taken lives to someone who had saved them. Sarah set the rifle on the ground and raised her hands as the tactical officers approached, identifying herself clearly and calmly. As they began securing the scene and taking her statement, she could hear Tommy's voice getting closer. Could hear him asking Mrs. Henderson where his sister was and when he could see her. Soon, she told herself. Soon she would hold him and explain what had happened in words an 8-year-old could understand. Soon they would go home together and begin processing this day that had changed everything. Soon she would have to decide who she was going to be now that she knew what she was capable of when the people she loved were threatened. But for now, she was simply Sarah Mitchell, standing in a school hallway where she'd just proven that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. 3 hours later, Sarah sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair in the principal's office, still wearing her yellow volunteer vest, now stained with dust and debris from the hallway confrontation. Detective Maria Santos, a woman roughly Sarah's age with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, had been interviewing her for the past hour while federal agents processed the scene and questioned witnesses. Through the office windows, Sarah could see the school courtyard where families were reuniting with their children. Tommy was with Mrs. Coming. Henderson in the library, where a crisis counselor was helping the children process what they'd experienced. Sarah had been allowed to see him briefly after her initial statement, long enough to assure him she was okay and that they would go home together soon. "Let me make sure I understand the timeline correctly," Detective Santos said, reviewing her notes. "You engaged 3 armed individuals, all of whom were carrying military-style weapons and tactical equipment. You used a hunting rifle borrowed from the school to neutralize all 3 threats. No civilians were injured beyond minor cuts from broken glass and trauma-related stress. That's correct. And your military background includes 3 tours in Afghanistan as a designated marksman with the 75th Ranger Regiment, multiple commendations for actions under fire, and specialized training in close-quarters combat and civilian protection scenarios." Sarah nodded. She provided her complete military record, knowing that her actions would be scrutinized intensely. The legal implications of a civilian using lethal force were complex, but her military training and the immediate threat to children would likely provide clear justification under both state and federal law. "Sarah," Detective Santos said, setting down her pen and looking directly at her. What you did today saved dozens of lives. The FBI's preliminary assessment suggests these individuals were planning a mass casualty event specifically targeting children. Without your intervention, she didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah understood. In Afghanistan, she'd seen the aftermath of attacks on schools and other civilian targets. She knew what would have happened if the attackers had reached the classrooms. "I just want to take Tommy home," Sarah said quietly. "He's been through enough." "Of course. We'll need you to remain available for follow-up questions over the next few days, and there will be a formal review process. But you're free to leave as soon as we finish here." There was a soft knock on the door, and Principal Rodriguez entered with Tommy at his side. The 8-year-old still wore his pig costume from the play, though the pig nose had been lost somewhere during the lockdown. His face lit up when he saw Sarah, and he ran toward her without hesitation. "Sarah, Mrs. Henderson said you helped keep everyone safe." Sarah knelt down and pulled Tommy into a tight hug, feeling some of the tension leave her body for the first time since the shooting started. "Hey, buddy, are you okay? That was pretty scary, wasn't it?" "I wasn't really scared," Tommy said with 8-year-old bravado. "I knew you were close by." "Mrs. Henderson told us that sometimes grown-ups have to do hard things to protect children, and that you are very brave." Over Tommy's head, Sarah met Mrs. Henderson's eyes and saw understanding there. The elderly teacher had spent 30 years helping children process difficult experiences, and she'd found a way to help Tommy understand what his sister had done without traumatizing him with the details.
Are we going home now?
Tommy asked, looking up at Sarah. "Can we still get ice cream like you promised?" Sarah laughed despite everything, remembering the casual promise she'd made that morning when Tommy was excited about his performance. "Yes, we can still get ice cream. But first, we need to answer a few more questions, okay?" Detective Santos smiled. "Actually, I think we're finished here. Sarah, you have my card. Please call if you remember anything else or if you need any support resources. The department has counseling services available for civilians involved in critical incidents." As they prepared to leave, Principal Rodriguez approached Sarah with an expression of profound gratitude. "Sarah, I don't know how to thank you. What you did, those children, their families, you don't need to thank me," Sarah interrupted gently. "I just did what needed to be done." But as they walked out of the building together, Tommy chattering about wanting to tell his friends about the adventure at school, Sarah realized that wasn't entirely true. She hadn't just done what needed to be done, she'd chosen to do what needed to be done. Despite the personal cost, despite the risk, despite the fact that it meant confronting parts of herself she'd been trying to leave behind. The school parking lot was still busy with emergency vehicles and media trucks, but the immediate chaos had settled into the organized aftermath of crisis response. Sarah guided Tommy toward her car, hoping to avoid the reporters who were interviewing families and emergency responders. They almost made it. "Excuse me, are you Sarah Mitchell?" Sarah turned to see a young woman with a press badge and a camera operator behind her. She instinctively moved to shield Tommy from the camera while considering her response. "I'm not interested in giving interviews," Sarah said firmly. "Ma'am, we understand you're the person who stopped the attackers. People are calling you a hero. Don't you want to share your story?" Sarah looked down at Tommy, who was watching the interaction with curiosity but no real understanding of what the reporter was asking about. Hero. The word felt strange and uncomfortable. Heroes were people like Mrs. Henderson, who had spent 3 decades educating children and had kept them calm during the worst experience of their lives. Heroes were the police officers who had rushed toward gunfire to protect strangers. Heroes were the parents who had grabbed other people's children and carried them to safety. Sarah had just been a big sister doing whatever it took to protect her family. "No comment," she said to the reporter, then guided Tommy toward their car. As they drove home through their quiet suburban neighborhood, Tommy fell asleep in the back seat, exhausted by the day's events. Sarah found herself taking the long route, not quite ready to return to their normal evening routine of homework and dinner preparation. Everything looked the same as it had that morning. The same houses, the same perfectly maintained lawns, the same peaceful atmosphere of a community where the most serious daily concern was usually traffic on the way to work. But Sarah knew that she had fundamentally changed, not just today, but over the course of the entire 2 years since she'd become Tommy's guardian. She'd thought she was leaving her military identity behind, building a new life as a civilian. Instead, she'd been integrating both parts of herself into someone new, someone who could deliver flowers and help with homework and attend school plays, but who could also make life and death decisions under pressure when protecting innocent people. At home, Sarah carried sleeping Tommy to his room and tucked him in, still wearing his costume. Tomorrow there would be conversations about what happened, questions from school officials and law enforcement, probably media attention she didn't want. There would be therapy sessions to help Tommy process the experience, and probably therapy sessions to help her process it as well. But tonight, there was just a quiet satisfaction of knowing that Tommy was safe in his own bed, that Mrs. Henderson's students would go home to their families, that 36 children would grow up to have high school graduations and college experiences and families of their own. Sarah made herself a cup of tea and sat at her kitchen table, looking at the framed photo of her and Tommy from his first day of school. In the picture, they were both smiling, excited about new beginnings and fresh starts. She'd been so focused on building a normal life that she'd missed the possibility that maybe normal wasn't what she was meant for. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed her former commanding officer's number. "Colonel Harrison," she answered. "Sarah, I heard what happened today. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, sir. Tommy's fine. Everyone's fine. I'm proud of you, Sergeant. You used your training to protect innocent civilians under extreme circumstances. That's exactly what we trained you to do." Sarah considered his words. "Colonel, when I left the service, I thought I was done with all that. I wanted to build a quiet life." "Sarah, you saved dozens of children today. You think that means you're not meant for a quiet life?" "I think it means I'm not the same person I was when I left Afghanistan, but I'm also not the same person I was this morning." Colonel Harrison was quiet for a moment. "You know, Sarah, there are other ways to serve, other ways to use your skills to protect people. Have you ever considered that?" After they ended the call, Sarah sat in her kitchen for a long time, thinking about possibilities she'd never considered. Federal law enforcement agencies that specialized in protecting schools and other civilian targets. Private security firms that trained educators and administrators for emergency situations. Consulting work that could help other communities prepare for the kind of threat they'd face today. She was still considering those possibilities when Tommy appeared in the kitchen doorway, rubbing his eyes and wearing pajamas instead of his pig costume. "Sarah, I had a bad dream about loud noises." "Come here, buddy." Tommy climbed into her lap, and Sarah held him while he settled back into comfortable sleepiness. This was what mattered most, not the career decisions or the public recognition or the questions about heroism. Just this moment, this child who trusted her completely, this quiet house where they'd built a family together. Whatever came next, whatever changes today had brought to their lives, Sarah knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would always be willing to stand between Tommy and anything that threatened him. That wasn't heroism or duty or training, that was love, pure and simple. And sometimes, love was enough to change everything. Outside their kitchen window, the suburban neighborhood continued its peaceful evening routine, unaware that one of its residents had just discovered something important about herself. Sarah Mitchell was exactly who she was supposed to be, someone strong enough to protect the people she loved, wise enough to know when that protection was necessary, and brave enough to act when action was required. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new questions, but tonight, she was simply a big sister, holding her little brother, both of them safe at home where they belonged.